of the emerging, very influential journalists in the United States. She's been a business reporter with the New York Times since 2006. In 2012, she made the transition to becoming an investigative reporter at the New York Times. She's also a marathon runner. She's also a rock climber. Now, in an effort for complete transparency, we want to let you know that no incentives were offered for Louise to come here today. But I'm actually awfully glad she decided to join us here today. She's going to discuss the series. She has just a small number of slides, 1 or 2 videos from her work that she's going to share. She's going to talk for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then turn it over to you guys for questions. So I hope you have some good questions for her. And without further ado, Louise Story. Thank you.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here. And just to tag on that point about no incentives, I would say it was incentive enough for me to get to meet and speak with you all, because in the course of my reporting, I talked to a lot of different kinds of people in companies, people in governments, private consultants. But I also talked to, a lot of people in this association, and I found that people who've worked in economic development for decades have often a very broad point of view and long-term interest in their communities, and that's really important. So I'll get going here, and I'm just going to give a little overview and get to your questions. So you might wonder, what's an investigative reporter at the New York Times doing, looking at economic development and business incentives? About a year ago, I was talking with my bosses about what I would dig into for the year, and Fresh Direct, it's an online grocery company in the New York City area. They were in the middle of a bidding war between New York and New Jersey. And so my boss just casually said to me, what do these cost? I mean, you hear about these everywhere across the country. What do these add up to? And I said, okay, I'll get back to you with that figure in a couple hours. Because I thought it would be known what all this money you spend on companies across the country adds up to. Well, as I dug into it, as you all well know, actually it's not known. This is a very local process, and there was no one in the federal government or the national level, who was collecting all the costs from governments across the country. And so I said, and as I talked to people said, we'd love to know what it costs. So I said to my boss, I can't get you a figure that's going to include everything, because I can't go to every city, and in fact, there would be a lot of places I would go to that they won't know the cost of them. But I can take a start. I can go to 50 states, I can see what I can get, and I can make this, a start towards something that people could start looking at nationally. And so what I found, I did manage to get figures on a lot of incentive programs. And I put them all online. Probably a lot of you have seen this database that I created on the cost of incentive programs. But what I found was 2 things. First of all, there have been great organizations out there that have been collecting figures on individual deals given to companies. Some of these are nonprofits, some of these are private consulting firms that do that. But what I realized was, wait a minute, if you go to a state government or a state agency and you say, I'll take the whole cost for this program, a 1-year cost, even if you don't want to tell me the companies who get it, you can actually get a lot more figures than you can get if you only are going to tally them with company names. Because there's a lot of places that think that there's taxpayer confidentiality, and so they won't give it to the company name, but they'll give you an overall figure. So in each of the states, I started by looking at what does state governments say are their incentives. So I would go to these websites, you all know them well, Open for Business in the different states and cities, and I would click on their incentives to see what they list, because there also was not a national list of just what's out there that I could find with all of these. And so from what they said were their incentives, I would then go to agencies in each state and say, well, tell me what that cost in the most recent year it's available. And I took a lot of steps to be conservative, for instance, like with tax credits. A lot of states would start sending me figures on how many they awarded But I wanted to, for my cost figure, use money that was out the door foregone, so I would insist, no, please give me the tax credits that were used figure. So what I found was that, you know, what I considered to be incentives added up to 80 billion, but it's missing a lot. And for instance, it's for most places, it's missing all of the property tax abatements that are given to companies. Because most states don't go to their cities and counties and say, tell us that. But I was well aware that people are going to, it's a long range of things that people will consider incentives or not. And so that's why I put everything online so that you can draw your own conclusions, you can see what's not there, what's there, and you can come to your own view of this. What I didn't find, I did not find the absolute figure because that is impossible right now. And so that's something, it would be interesting, you know, if there were a way to get to that, we'll come back to that maybe later, but I couldn't go to every city. I went to, for the most part, state agencies, hundreds of state agencies, because I went to multiple ones in every state. I do think that this is an area where there's room for a lot more research, because so little has been known in a bigger scale kind of way. There's a lot of great research out there, but a lot of it looks at just one state or a couple states or just one industry. And I'm heartened to tell you that actually already I've heard from several dozen researchers who have written me from different places like the Federal Reserve, Duke, and Stanford, and said, we've always wanted a step towards a lot of cost data. Thank you, and now we're going to do new research using it. So there's more research starting, and I think that there is a lot of room for research. Now I'm going to talk about 3 areas that to me, and remember I'm an outsider, you know, I was coming at this cold, I didn't have the length of experience you all have, but these are areas that to me as an outsider coming in and looking around really got my attention as areas that people might want to pay attention to in today's world of economic development and business incentives. One is, why are places bidding against their neighbors? So just to give you a little flavor for that, I'm going to show you a short clip of a video that's on the site with my project. There's a longer version online, and here it is. Last year, Kansas City real estate developer Phil Kirk helped a group of local business leaders write a letter to their governors. They asked for a ceasefire in what they called a border war between Kansas and Missouri. The letter said that business incentives offered by the states were hurting the community.
The Kansas City community is experiencing an economic border war. State incentives are being used to lure businesses back and forth across the state line.
And the political side of the equation, a lot of governors, as they run for president or whatever, they talk about the job growth in their state, but they don't talk about at what cost. The job growth that's happened in the state of Kansas, even in the state of Missouri, by taking it just across state line, is statistically job growth, but it's coming with the cost.
An investigation by the New York Times revealed that local governments across the country give away more than $80 billion each year in the form of incentives for business. In Kansas City, which sits on the border of Kansas and Missouri, when a company takes an incentive and moves across the border, the ripple effect is immediate. Incentives are made in the name of job creation, but the balance between lower taxes for business and benefits to the community is rarely clear-cut. Sean Byrne runs an economic development association in Kansas City, Missouri. He works with many of the business leaders who signed the letter to Governors Brownback and Nixon.
The governors are the commanders-in-chief. It only takes 2 people to stop this insanity, and that's Governor Nixon and Governor Brownback. And they can say, stop giving incentives within the 5-county area or across both sides of the state line.
The letter was delivered to the governors in April 2011 and did not result in any change. When the New York Times followed up, it was clear there would be no end to the incentives war anytime soon.
We here in Missouri, we're ready to compete with anybody. I mean, I think we've got the best workers in the country. Our community college system is second to none. Missourians, as I said before, I mean, we're ready to compete. But the point, I think the bigger point is, just in the last 4 or 5 years, that competition, is not just between Missouri and Kansas or New York and Oklahoma. It's a worldwide competition.
I think it'd be better if we didn't have an overall picking winners incentive war. I think it'd be better if we had taxes much lower and did it on an atmosphere basis rather than approaching different companies. But we're virtually all in this game now, and I don't really see an easy or a quick exit from this competition.
So I'm sure in your communities you've seen the same thing, whether it's in counties or cities, and it definitely got my attention. And so just a few quick points on this. One thing that some places are already doing is regional cooperation, and I think that's an area that certainly within this organization you all could talk about and probably are talking about a great deal. Another thing I wanted to highlight is along the point that Governor Nixon from Missouri made, the global competition point. So I had a number of people tell me throughout this process, well, we got to give incentives because we're competing with China. But just to share a couple points with you, of course that's true. Of course companies have offshored. But actually within the company data that I looked at, in addition to the program data, I also looked at thousands of examples of companies that have recently gotten incentives. In a number of those entries, it did list where this company had been considering. And the vast majority of those were only considering within the United States. And this gelled with what I heard from consultants and companies, which was, of course we're considering going abroad. But they said, we often make that decision before we get to the incentive table. So that was an interesting finding. You're competing abroad, but are you competing abroad on incentives or on other things like workers' wages and bigger issues? So another thing I think would be interesting is nationally but also locally, will people start talking with their neighbors in a regional fashion? The second area that I found, my clicker's not working, there we go, that I found to be real interesting, which I alluded to in the beginning, is that there's just not a lot of transparency here. There's no federal data collection. And this is something that could be done easily. So I talked with the census a bunch, and you all probably know that localities file these things called CAFR reports, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report every year. And they say in these reports how much they collect in property tax, how much in sales tax, a lot of questions. So there could be questions added with no new survey required that say things like, well, what do you give out in cash grants? What do you pay for companies of property tax? It could be done. It's not done. It might help on the national level for people to understand more about this. There would be a lot of questions, of course, about what sort of data to collect. And but what I will tell you, it's not only about the cost, but also one of the most common things I heard from local officials was they had no way to truth squad what companies were telling them. So I heard from a lot of economic development officials and mayors, okay, so company XYZ says that in this other deal they got in this other state, they created X number of jobs and they also gave donations to the local communities and they did all this stuff. And short of calling that community, there was no way to check if this was really true. And often these local officials said they didn't have the resources to really go call and check it out on a regular basis. But also, it was awkward because they're trying to lure the company at the same time. And sometimes they're competing with that place. So how do you truth squad with a competitor? So another type of information that certainly I heard could be helpful on a national level would be not only cost, but also how do these companies do when they get these things? What do they get? What do they deliver? And that would be helpful to people all over. Another area is, and this is probably something you all think a lot about, is just the nitty-gritty in the details of designing these deals. So you've decided you're giving out a certain number of incentives, deal design, and there's of course been a lot of movement to have clawbacks in recent years, but there are ways that this could go further and would be an interesting area for you all to discuss. So for instance, job expectations. One thing I found here that was very interesting is that I heard from a lot of places that they would give incentives if a company promised jobs, or sometimes if a company promised to invest a certain amount of capital, that amount of capital wasn't always tied to jobs. And this is actually something that's rooted a little bit in the old economy. So it used to be if you came and you spent $2 billion somewhere, of course you'd be, creating jobs, you're spending $2 billion. Well, now you have things like data warehouses, okay, that are really expensive but don't create a lot of jobs. So one area to rethink is expectations. Is it enough to just put in capital now? Another thing is, and I had a large part of my second story in the series that it focused on an example of a consultant in Texas, but I found that there were very few rules in places about the uses of consultants and how consultants could be paid, for instance. Many consultants are paid a cut of what that company gets. So their incentive, the consultant's incentive, is to push the company to get the most as possible. So that's an area. And often those consultants, by the way, get the money up front immediately, not over time when you see if the company delivers. So that's something that could perhaps be in deal contracts. Another thing is, just again, what else can a government ask for? What is, when your company is so able to move now, we have moved a bit away from the world where companies are really rooted in one place and tied to that community. So what other things can you ask for in terms of community involvement that go beyond jobs? And then, the question I have to you all on these sorts of thoughts is, of course, you might be in a disadvantage getting a company if you're making the contract real strict compared to someone else. So are there ways that you all can work together to have some of these standard sorts of expectations so that your community is not at a disadvantage? And I'd love to hear from you all more in the Q&A if that's possible. Last thing I'll leave you with before we go to the Q&A, it's a video about film incentives, movie credits. I know that's not the area that most of you all work in, but watch this for how it is relevant for what you do in the sense of the question of whether they'd be there without the incentive, something I'm sure you face with lots of companies. This summer, New York City streets were abuzz with the production of Martin Scorsese's new movie, The Wolf of Wall Street, starring Leonardo DiCaprio. It's the latest in a series of movies shot here since the financial crisis.
The mother of all evil is speculation. Leverage debt.
In 2009, Oscar-winning director Oliver Stone made Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps, and a year later, up-and-coming filmmaker J.C. Chandor made Margin Call.
And you're selling something that you know has no value.
We are selling to willing buyers at the current fair market price, so that we may survive.
I knew I wanted to shoot the film in New York because it was written in New York.
It had to be here. And it wouldn't have made sense to shoot it anywhere else.
There was no question it had to be in New York. The original was New York represents Wall Street. You can't fake that.
Beyond the obvious appeal of the Manhattan backdrop, there was an added bonus. In exchange for making movies about Wall Street in New York City, the productions received tax credits from the state covering up to 30% of all labor costs.
It's literally free money. The tax credit represents cash that they use to pay for the budget.
It's part of a program that each year costs the state about $400 million in tax revenue. The question is, how much of that money goes to subsidize movies that would have been made here anyway?
That $400 million might have been used by local governments in a way to keep more police or firefighters on the payroll, or to hire more teachers, or to lay off fewer teachers.
The state and city insist these tax credits are necessary, that they keep good jobs in the state, and that without them, New York's movie industry would collapse.
The tax credit that is offered by New York State is designed to keep productions here for longer periods of time. They have to do 75% of their location work here, and they have to do 75% of their stage work.
In addition to the state tax credit, the city has its own program called Made in New York. It gives movie productions keys to the city, providing police and logistical help, not to mention free advertising.
This is a very competitive business, and I think that the tax credits, like them or not, whether they work or not, they're here, and they're in place, and that is why New York had to get in the game.
It wasn't always cut it there. It all started in the late 1990s, but you can see the full version of that as well as the full version of the Kansas City one with the stories. So with that, I open up to questions. I'm excited to hear what you all have to say.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for coming, Louise. I have a kind of a personal question. What conclusions did you arrive at, outside of the reporting? If you had a magic wand to wave on the question of incentives, what would that result in?
Well, I think it's tied to kind of what I went over, but which is that perhaps it's my bias being a journalist, but I always think transparency is a great thing, and I was really surprised by the lack of national information on this, because it's the whole discussion in Washington now is how do we keep jobs in the United States, and they don't know about the collective cost and benefits of what local officials are doing. They don't know where layoffs are happening across the country. They don't know. So that I think is something that was surprising and something that could be improved.
Your magic wand wouldn't eliminate incentives, or would it?
I think that incentives, as well as a lot of ways of doing business and economic development, should be questioned and should be continually questioned. But I think the first step is to get thorough national information on what the costs and benefits are. You cannot do this analysis without knowing that, and it was impossible. I mean, for instance, I'll tell you one thing that was surprising to me, is that in addition to no cost information nationally, you don't know about job creation nationally, because you don't know where companies are laying off and where they're adding. And this could also be done nationally. You all probably know about the WARN notices that companies are required to file in their states. It's a federal law. It's from the 1980s. It says if you lay off workers, you have to file a WARN notice. And they have to file with the states. Well, the federal government does nothing to collect those from the 50 states. If they did, you could see where companies are, for instance, getting an incentive here and laying off there. And then you could at least have a dialogue on, well, is that worth it? Is that good? But I don't really think you can answer your question without much better information.
Thank you for being here, Louise. I won't say what state I'm from at this point, but as a state economic developer, I manage enterprise-owned programs, film tax credits for investors in high-tech companies, and that sort of thing. But its cost is only half of the equation. It's a cost benefit. Our economists in our state know exactly, from an input-output model, the benefit of a dollar of tax money spent. In construction, it's 2.5. In retail, it's 1.2. It's never less than 1. It comes back to the state in tax revenue.
Let me ask you one question. What state are you from?
Well, I won't say what state, but if you watch Hawaii 501 Monday night, you might have a clue.
No, I just would like to speak to your state to engage in the conversation with you. Where are you from?
Hawaii.
Oh, you're from Hawaii. Okay. Well, Hawaii really surprised me. They had actually some of the worst data of any state. They have not done a tax expenditure report since 2005.
The tax department has not, the economic development.
I understand. But from an analysis standpoint, you do need to know, for instance, how many tax credits are used. And it was the worst state of the 51 places I looked in terms of data available to the public. I FOIA'd, and they have not updated their tax expenditure report since 2005.
That's the tax department. That's not the economic development.
You could push for that to happen
I've been arguing
potentially.
this issue with them for about 20 years.
Well, that's great. But anyways, I am thrilled that you look at the cost and the benefits, and I actually think one step that where research could take this and would be great would be also more research on the benefits. It took me 4.5 months to get the limited information I did get, which was a lot of information on the cost. And I think someone should also look at the benefits.
Bad guy? Is there someone who is a bad guy in this, or maybe expand a little bit on your comments on the consultant side of it as well?
So no, I did not find a bad guy. I don't think there is one here. I think that this is a situation where it's a systemic problem, and that everyone within this system is acting rationally, and this is why you have government. You have government
sometimes to step back in a broader way and to make sure that the self-actors don't end up not adding up to a bigger goal. And that's why, again, I think that there's a national question here. On the consultants, I mean, I talked to tons of consultants who have wonderful intentions, tons of great knowledge and experience in this area, and I don't think they're villains either. But again, they have their self-interest, and some take that further than others. I mean, there is a consultant that I highlighted in the second story that when their client did not want to follow through on some tax savings, they sued the client. So it's to a different degree and with different people, but I don't think there's a villain.
I see we have some more people lined up, so go ahead.
I have a couple of questions. One's a little cheeky, and one I'd actually like to get some more information from you on. But the first one is, did the New York Times Corporation receive any tax? What was the incentive package?
We did, and that's in story 1, so go back and read it. We also included them all in our database.
For additional academic research?
There is a lot of additional research already happening in this area. I know because I've heard from the academics, and I've had a pretty open door policy, so I've spent actually hours on the phone with all these different academics digging into it to answer their nitty-gritty questions in the database, because I didn't want it to read like an academic paper, so I didn't put every nitty-gritty thing up there, but I've been taking questions when they come to me. So yeah, there's more academic research. I mean, again, I don't mean to sound like broken record, but I think national information is needed here so that there can be an evaluation, a good evaluation of the cost and benefits.
Good morning, I'm Jim Schimmer from Columbus, Ohio. I'll just say, first of all, I appreciate you turning the lens back towards us a little bit, because I think we need to do that on a regular basis. And we're all smart people, so hopefully we can think about how we can do business differently. We hear so much about innovation, and I think we have to innovate ourselves in a lot of ways and push people in government to do that. Here's a question for you. I'm just curious about whether or not you had a chance to take a look at EB5 investments that are made from foreign investors in our company. That seems pretty intriguing to me, and I'd just be interested to know if you've looked at that at all.
I did look at that program, and in fact, the Times, we had a story on that set in Vermont around the turn of the year. It's a real interesting program for those of you all that don't know about it. I don't have every detail down exactly.
Well, where there's a high level of transparency and also good analysis on return on investment.
Well, I mean, there is no state that has all the information they need to have, because there is no state that has it from also all the localities. And it's really part of the same picture, because these deals often have a state and a city and even sometimes also a county component. So there isn't a state that has it all. But more and more states have introduced clawbacks in the last decade, and certainly, is something that can help hold companies accountable and protect taxpayer money. One thing, though, that I did find in that to some degree is, first of all, I did hear in some places a reluctance to enforce clawbacks, because people were afraid that would mean companies wouldn't want to come there. I think when the clawbacks at the state level in a very regimented way, it's easier to enforce it, but at a local level. Another thing that really, got my attention was this idea of, well, what happens when a company goes bankrupt? And that's why I told the first story through General Motors, which has long been and still is a big user of incentives. And so I'll tell you what happened when GM went bankrupt. Even places that had clawbacks didn't get the money back. So, for instance, one place I wrote about a lot in that first story was Ypsilanti, Michigan. And they had had a bad experience with GM in the early 90s. They had 2 facilities there. And GM had left one to move some business to Texas. And Ypsilanti sued GM. Almost the lower judge, the lower court said, no, GM can't leave, which, as you all know, would have been could have had landmark implications in economic development if you couldn't leave if you had a deal. But the higher court ruled that no, it's not a promise, it's not binding. They say they can create these jobs, and so they left. But after that, Ypsilanti and their other facility did put in a lot of explicit clawbacks that should have held up if it left. But they don't hold up in bankruptcy, and so Ypsilanti is just out of luck. So one thing that I thought about and heard from some different people, and it's happening a little bit in some places, is using equity or using debt
debt going into the capital structure of companies. If you all are making an investment in them because they're making an investment in your community, if you were in the capital structure, you had secured debt with them, for instance, as long as there was some money left over in bankruptcy, you would get some. In a lot of cases, there is. A lot of creditors get at least part of the money back. So that would be an area where you could push that a little further.
Another question?
Economic developers' role was to look out for the public where they lived. This was a unique and important role, of course, because a private consultant is looking after the company's looking after the company, and elected officials, have a lot of agendas. So it seems like the local official was looking after the people over the longer term, and that's really admirable. One trend that seems to be going on, and when I've talked to people who've been in the business a long time, it wasn't so existent a few decades ago, is really a merger in this business between the economic development offices and the business recruitment people. And it's unclear whether these are the same things, but I found a number of examples, and I mentioned one in story 2, I mentioned Irving, Texas, where cities, to cut costs, or perhaps because they believe they'd be more effective, instead of having someone who worked for the city doing the economic development, they would contract with the chambers of commerce, which, as you know, the members are businesses. And so, that's I think a question for people in the industry about, again, are you representing business? Are you representing everyone, which would include business, but would also include kids in schools and taxpayers? And it does seem like those worlds of business development, economic development, have been merging in some places. I know we're out of time, but I want to let you know I'm not in a rush, and I'll stand somewhere in the hallway or something, and I really am happy to talk with any of you who would like to talk with me.
Before you get that,